Hello and welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. We did have some people flowing in at the last minute, so we just wanted to give them a chance to connect before we started talking, and they missed out at the beginning. But you have joined the future of PKI in the modern enterprise. So if that's what you're expecting, you're at the right place. Once again, we thank you for joining us. And this webinar today, I am Tim Callan. I am Senior Fellow at Sectigo, and I will be your moderator today. I am joined by Jason Soroko, who is the CTO of Internet of Things here at Sectigo, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today, Jason.
Hey, Tim, great to be with you this morning.
Hey, great, exactly. Let's talk a little bit of detail about this webinar and then get right into it. So we are expecting this one to be short and sweet. We're estimating at 20 minutes plus Q&A. And so that we know everybody's busy, you can get back to your days. We do have everyone on mute. We tend to have a lot of attendees on our webinars, and otherwise you hear somebody's barking dog or the siren driving by. So we do keep everybody on mute. If you do have a question, we recommend that you use the chat box in your interface, and you'll see an interface that looks like the image we have here. You can just type your question right in there and hit send, and that'll come to us, the organizers. And then what'll happen is our associate, Mark Anthony Gaunt, is on the phone as well. Mark is keeping an eye on the interface and keeping an eye on the questions, and he'll either answer you directly if it's the kind of one-off thing that he can just solve, but if it's good for the whole group, usually most of them get resolved that way, but if it's good for the whole group, he'll hang on to it and we'll go over it at the end. So feel free to ask your question anytime you want, and we will make sure that everybody's questions get answered. And with that, let's go ahead and get into it if you're ready, Jason.
Yes, sir.
Okie doke. So we're talking today about private CA, and take it away.
Well, a lot of you who were on this call probably have an interest in PKI, probably have an interest in some use case with regards to certificates and how you've been using them. And, the use cases are so vast, I've seen passport systems, finance systems, badge-in systems, various forms of authentication support that PKI is doing. But I think today, Tim, one of the things that we're going to be doing is talking about just the explosion of brand new use cases and new stacks of technologies that are supporting those use cases that just didn't exist in the past, 10, 15, perhaps even 5 years ago.
Sure. One of the things you said to me on our podcast at one point is you said, this isn't your grandfather's PKI. And I laughed because at the concept, but if you think about it, PKI's been around since the 80s. And
it has. And I can tell you right now, Tim, I think one of the things we talked about on our podcast previously, and one thing that we really should talk about right at the start of this is, everybody has a starting position from today. And that starting position might and probably does include something like a Microsoft CA, which was a default implementation for a lot of enterprises to support something as basic as authentication for users who are essentially Active Directory based, policy driven type of organizations. So in other words, what we've seen in the past, obviously, is the first bullet point, which is PKI used to be able to control the life cycle of users. And human beings have a very, very specific kind of life cycle. They typically get onboarded and hired. They are assigned all kinds of policies and credentials, and then eventually they may leave the company and therefore need to have those credentials revoked. But the unbelievable number of technologies that we're seeing is causing an explosion in all kinds of other devices that are not necessarily a Microsoft stack. And and this gets into some really exotic stuff, but interesting stuff is even PKI used to control access and authentication into various computing processes. So it's an exciting world right now, Tim. But this webinar is really about the current state that a lot of people are at and how they can potentially extend what they have into the future.
Yeah,
because right now there's a real trouble in doing that.
Sure, and if I may, I think we'll observe that the the conditions that used to be solved very well by a standalone Microsoft CA that you run inside of your own network. Imagine a very 2000s kind of IT setup where I have a big refrigerated room with a drop floor and racks full of servers, right? That kind of situation was very good for Microsoft CA. It could do the job quite well, but as we look at how an enterprise architects its computing resources today, as we move into what we're going to get into, you're going to see that those are a lot of scenarios that a Microsoft CA just can't handle.
Yeah, if you were an IT person back in the 90s and 2000s, it was quite common that a lot of people might have spent their entire career working within the Microsoft stack of technologies.
Right.
I think one of the jokes you and I made, and it wasn't really a joke, it's the reality of it, is the extreme rate of change that we've seen even within Microsoft itself. Even if you are a Microsoft employee, you're no
Right.
longer in the Microsoft stack, which is really what this webinar is all about.
Absolutely right. Yes, there was a day where an entire enterprise might be every employee might be living in the Microsoft stack for all things they did that were related to their job. And now we can't even conceive of that. And we'll get into that. So you've identified, I put at least when I made this slide, by the way, this is the busiest slide by far, so don't be panicked. I put at least 8 use cases because there might be others that we didn't even bring up today, but I know that you, Jay, have identified for me 8 distinct use cases where you cannot address it with a Microsoft CA that are
That's
common.
right. And if you are trying to address it, you're going to experience a lot of pain. I think maybe one of the other things we should talk about right at the top of the webinar as well is when we're talking in our podcast, Tim, I think one of the recurring themes that we see, especially when we talk about news items, is how many times have we seen in the news now where expired certs or mishandled certificates, which is typically behind it somebody with a spreadsheet or perhaps even less level of management, handling, hey, I issued a pile of certs to some disparate system. I'm not really tracking that well, and perhaps the government hasn't shut down. Perhaps nobody's just keeping track of the certs, and therefore poor management has led to just tremendous amounts of downtime and mayhem. This is the kind of thing that we're trying to avoid.
Right, agreed. So shall we get into the use cases?
Yeah, this should be fun.
Okay, this should be fun. So number 1, mobile and BYOD.
So I think the joke we said before, and I think it's worth repeating, is how many enterprises today have their staff working on mobile devices in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, and 100%. Without having seen any research on it, I know the answer is 100%.
Right, and then the question, and you've got the answer right on the screen.
Right.
What's the percentage who are actually purely Microsoft stack mobile devices?
Right. Purely
And
Microsoft stack, 0%.
it's basically 0%. And so therefore, if you're running Android, if your employees are running Android, which is quite common, or iOS, how do you handle that? Now, the answer is there's a lot of really tremendous MDM tools out there for enterprises. The thing is, though, you might want to be looking at PKI that is not necessarily Microsoft CA. There are, and you're going to hear this term over and over again, Tim, but very purpose-built PKI systems out there. There are purpose-built CAs that are tightly integrated with those MTMs, and not just that. And I don't want to give away too much of what's in the bag here, but there are some purpose-built CAs out there that are also very tightly integrated into some of these use cases that we will be talking about. So mobile is if your enterprise is doing some form of your employees are carrying around mobile devices and working on them, your Microsoft CA is probably already causing a constraint for you.
Right. And so the last point here is just to further complicate things. It's not just mobile devices necessarily that you assign, right? There's also a BYOD component where critical processes are happening on devices that are just coming in from the wild where you have no control over what those devices are going to be.
That's a use case that's incredibly important.
Yeah.
And I know that, for the folks out there who are questioning this topic, your MDM is probably handling a lot of those use cases. But I just wanted to let you guys know there are also now changes within the operating systems themselves, which give you a lot of things that the MDMs were giving you previously. So heads up for that.
All right. Use case number 2, public SMIME for email.
Yeah. Tim, with GDPR in Europe and the amount of business email compromise going on in the world today, the uptick for SMIME, I mean, it's been around an awfully long time as a technology. But if you want to be able to send SMIME certificates, and this is the big challenge, Tim, you're going to want the same SMIME cert on your mobile device, on your laptop, and anywhere else you're doing your emails. And so, because typically as an employee, you're not just a one device person anymore.
Right.
So being able to properly deliver and seamlessly deliver those certificates, those SMIME certificates for email, that's going to be an awfully terrible challenge to your Microsoft
Yeah.
CA if that's what you happen to be using.
If we're standardizing on SMIME across our enterprise because you want to see those 3 benefits that are listed on the left, then you've got to support every device that person might be using email with, and that includes their BYOD mobile phone. That might include a tablet, 1 or more tablets that they own. That might include a Road Warrior style MacBook in addition to the Windows desktops that are sitting in your headquarters or your offices. Those are all real scenarios, and you got to cover all of them, or you're not standardizing on SMIME.
And I'll tell you just one last point on this one, Tim. The changes within the native mobile operating systems, especially iOS, are enabling third-party CA companies like us to be able to very, very seamlessly push the SMIME certificates to your users' devices, and it's actually quite an exciting world right now for that.
Right. We did a whole podcast on this. The SMIME, if you want to look at the ratio of how long a technology has been around to how much it's used, SMIME probably leads on that because it's been around forever, but it never really picked up. And our belief is that that's why, it's because it's been hard. And the good news is lately it's gotten much, much easier.
That's good news.
All right, moving on. SSH keys.
Yeah, who here hasn't used SSH keys, especially with the explosion of remote access out to the cloud? Tim, in terms of all of these use cases that we're talking about right now, SSH key management might be the most dismal out of all of them in terms of the current state. And the interesting thing is SSH keys, the initial implementation of it, it wasn't even a certificate, it was just keys.
Right.
Therefore, it's not even, it had nothing to do with your GPOs and your Active Directory, and therefore this key material was not coming out of Microsoft CA. It's a use case that needs to be handled by not your grandfather's PKI, in other words.
Absolutely. Okay, number 4, web servers.
Yeah. So Tim, this is one that quite closer to your heart. But if the automation of getting SSL certificates up to your web servers is now much better handled by protocols such as Acme and some other technologies that we're talking about in other forms. And again, this is because of also CAB forum rules and everything else. You're not handling your web server automation from your web server SSL automation from your Microsoft CA. Once again, this is completely out of the realm of the Microsoft stack.
Back in the 2000s or the early teens, what you would have done is you could have just handled this with SSL, but that's not allowed anymore. So people need to find another solution. And as you can see from the market share here, it's very unlikely that those web servers are running Windows.
again, this comes down to purpose-built PKI, where there are technologies now to automate this. And at the top of this webcast, we talked about outages. This is quite often where those outages were happening.
Yeah. Okay. Number 5, Internet of Things.
Yeah, this one obviously is close to my heart. And the term purpose-built probably takes on an entirely new meaning here, because we're talking about scalability. We're talking about reliability. We're talking about the needs of IoT device vendors that go far beyond what a Microsoft CA could do for you, especially when you consider, what are the technologies, what are the stacks of technologies that exist on IoT devices?
Right.
Well, believe me, Windows is
Right. So
Windows is a pretty.
this chart is based on a survey that this group, the Eclipse Foundation, did of 1,700 enterprises that use IoT, and it was a pick all. So more than 75% of them had picked Linux as an operating system they had for their IoT devices, and then these are the other ones they may also have picked. And as you can see, among people who picked Windows at all, it was only 20%. Which means that 80% of them don't use Windows at all, and it could very well be nearly 0% that are exclusively on Windows.
And I bet you that 20% is almost entirely point of sale devices and ATMs.
Right. Yes, you're probably right. All right. So yeah, Internet of Things, big, huge, important. Everybody's thinking about it, and your old-fashioned operating systems don't do that. Number 6, DevOps.
Yeah, what an incredibly important growing topic right now. If your organization is looking at going cloud native, if you're looking at DevOps, agile style development practices, if you're using Kubernetes clusters and installing self-signed CAs on that, if you're issuing TLS certificates into Docker containers, I mean, we could go on and on and on. We could have several podcasts and webcasts
Right.
just on this topic alone. You're not handling this from your Microsoft CA. Talk about purpose-built PKI for a moment, Tim.
Yeah.
I think what's important to note here is even just the timing, the life cycle of some of these ephemeral functions that work within DevOps. They're now calling. We have customers asking us for certificates that are lasting in the range of hours.
Yeah.
Rather than days or months or years. That takes a purpose-built PKI. I think Microsoft CA is this is now the deep waters where Microsoft CA will never swim.
Yeah, right. It needs to be automated. When processes are being controlled and destroyed as needed, it absolutely needs to be automated. You don't have a human sitting there assigning and tracking certs. And yes, if the cert has dropped in duration, average lifespan from 1 year to 1 day, you can bet that the number of certs has increased proportionally. And so those both become very important for a purpose-built PKI that is designed to deal with this scenario.
If you're looking at this slide wondering, geez, I don't know if my organization does DevOps, I can tell you right now that I'd be shocked if any organization wasn't looking at doing this and going in this direction. This is the future of how enterprise software will be built.
Yeah, if you aren't, you're going to be, and you got to figure out how to deal with it. All right, number 7, cloud.
Yeah, we did talk about SSH keys earlier,
Right.
but that was from human being administrator to cloud resource authentication, which is quite often done with SSH keys. The reason why we have this slide broken out by itself is because we're now seeing quite a lot of cloud applications that actually talk to each other.
Sure.
So just like in the IoT use case, Tim, you'll have devices talking to other devices. Obviously TLS certificates needing to be issued to both sides. You also need the same thing for the cloud. And if you actually click on, I think is your next slide. This is
Sure.
the punchline for cloud. But it's not just one cloud anymore.
Yeah.
When you're now, think about how far away from just singular Microsoft stack this is, Tim. when not only are you using your own internal resources, which very well may be highly Microsoft based, you're now perhaps even VPC'd off into Amazon. You might tomorrow want to move some of those resources over to
Right.
Google Cloud or Azure. And as you said on the left-hand side, some of this might be public cloud or private cloud that you're hosting yourself, etc., or some hybrid of all of these things, which is
Yeah.
typically what we're seeing more and more within the environments today.
Yeah, and the other word that I could have put on here, I just didn't have a nice place to put it, was repatriation, right? One of the things that we see is that the amount of movement between environments is higher than a lot of people would expect. So you're continually evaluating which solution, or groups are continually evaluating which platform is best for what I want to do. They're thinking about compliance, security, performance, cost, and they are moving on a regular basis from platform to platform. They're taking it in, they're pushing it out, they're moving from one cloud platform to another, they're changing service packages on the platform they're already on. And all of that is routine and systematic. And in a complex IT environment, you could have different parts of a single process, if you will, living in different places. And as they talk to each other and trigger each other, you're actually moving from one cloud or one architecture to another one. And this happens all the time.
Distributed computing is the future,
Right.
and distributed computing means it from a PKI standpoint means that those distributed discrete
Yep.
pieces of logic all need to be able to communicate with each other securely, meaning every
Yeah.
one of the little bits of functions you have running in whatever cloud there is, or even on within one of your rack spaces,
Yeah.
they need certs. And believe me, that is not a singular Microsoft stack that Microsoft
Right.
CA can handle.
Exactly. Even if you're using Azure, it's a different story. And yeah, if you're not uh, uh, even if you have a work stream that's sitting on Microsoft today, you can't count on the fact that it's still going to be there in 6 months.
You got it.
All right. So these are the 8 use cases altogether. And like I said, there are probably others. And usually, like when we do a podcast, we'll get people reaching out to us to say, you forgot to mention this. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody comes out of this webinar and says, you forgot to mention blah, blah, blah. But here they all are, all together in one place. And when you look at all these together, what's the upshot on modern architectures and CAs, Jay?
The upshot, I would say that for all of these, we now have purpose-built PKI for these use cases. I think, without getting too much into the sales pitch of products that we could get into and probably will get into in future webcasts, suffice to say that we've solved a lot of the tough problems in this industry, and the future is
Yeah.
very bright.
Yeah, and this is and again, just to repeat something you said, if you look down this list and there's anything on this list you're not doing, there's a good chance that you are doing it in the next couple years to come. And there's a good chance for enterprises that you're doing everything on this list today, or that you will be in the next few years to come.
Yeah, if you're an executive making decisions from the office, and you don't do a lot of the administration of your resources, go over to your IT people and your developers and ask them about SSH keys and
Right.
multi-cloud and DevOps. I
And
pretty
DevOps,
much
yeah.
guarantee they'll say that they have been doing it, and they're managing it rather poorly.
Yeah. So yes, so very important. These are important areas of computing, and PKI needs to evolve to stick with computing architectures and how they're evolving, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I guess we covered this. There is a path forward. Do you want to add anything here?
I think one of the paths forward that we want to talk about on this slide has to do with, we've really, I don't think we've slandered Microsoft CA. I think that for what it was, it really did its job. It's very tightly integrated with the Microsoft stack, very tightly integrated with things like
Sure.
Active Directory, with which a lot of enterprises use. I think for very more simple human-based identities, it does what it does. But for any enterprise that's going into any of these use cases we have listed, I think what's really a bright light here, Tim, is we're not even asking you to strip out your Microsoft CA. You've probably spent a lot of time and effort to get it just right. It might be working just fine for what it does, but you might want to extend it to one or more of these areas.
Right.
And what I would encourage you to do is have a look at the offerings that are out there that can actually provide an abstraction layer on top of Microsoft CA in order to be able to then augment what you're doing with it. And it's kind of an exciting world right now.
It is. It's a very exciting world. It's an exciting time to be in PKI. So speaking of exciting times, I cannot have you on a webinar without mentioning our podcast. We referenced this only 5 times during the webinar. So guests, Jason and I run a podcast. It is called Root Causes, a PKI and security podcast. It is available on all of the places that you go get podcasting. And if you like this kind of material and this kind of in-depth discussion, we cover all kinds of matters that happen in the PKI world. Some of them are breaking news. Some of them are fundamentals to understand. Topics have included things like quantum resistant cryptography or the recent 63-bit serial name space fiasco, things along those lines. So if you want a nice deep dive on PKI and what's happening with it, we are always here. We are podcasting. We published our 12th podcast recently, and we're about to put up our 13th. We go at a pretty regular pace, so please subscribe and come listen to what we have to say. So let's move on to the questions real quick. Before we do that, we do have a white paper that's on this topic, how Private CA can help you with Microsoft CA, support your Microsoft CA. And everybody who signed up today, we will be sending you this white paper as a thank you. So that'll give you a chance to dive a little deeper on understanding this topic. And with that, why don't we go to the questions? Hey, Mark Anthony, have we gotten any questions? Mark Anthony, you're on mute. You're talking into your microphone on mute. All right, well, while we figure out our technical problems, I'm going to ask a question, Jay, from what we looked at earlier. So you talked a little bit about Internet of Things. I know that Internet of Things is a sort of a different animal from some of these others in a way, because those devices aren't really in your control, right? They're out in the field, they're custom-made devices, they're all self-contained. Does that mean that a PKI implementation for IoT needs to be kind of different from what we would have for other scenarios?
Yeah, let's bring up one topic where IoT needs to be different, and it's less about the stack of technologies. It actually has to do with the fact that a lot of devices need to be interoperable. How many times have you ever come across that problem set, Tim, within human-based identity management, where your employee needs to interact with an employee from a different company, and you need your PKI trust model to be able to fit that? It may happen, but it's unusual. But with IoT, it happens every single day. When you take a look at things like the OCF consortium, Aeromax, when you take a look at big companies out there like Duke Energy, which might have a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen vendors that are interacting with Duke Energy. They want to be able to have essentially what is a device ecosystem. And therefore, when you're doing issuance into ecosystems, you want to be able to manage not just the certificates that are going out and view the certificate profiles, but you also want to do things such as have separate and isolated administrative capabilities for each of the segments of that ecosystem. In other words, for each of the organizations and for any other layer you need on top of that. So there's a trust model component to the management of IoT devices beyond just scalability and reliability and all those other things that are probably more obvious and top of the list.
Cool. All right, so Mark Anthony has texted me on my phone, and he says for some reason he can't talk, he can't figure out why, so he is texting me questions, which I'm going to read. So here's the first one. Here's the question from a listener. It says, I'm hearing a lot about Acme these days. How does that fit in? So Acme ACME, Jay, maybe you could tell us briefly what it is and where that fits in this world.
Yeah, Acme is a very interesting technology. At the heart of it, it's really all about it's very tightly integrated typically with your web server. So we're talking now in the SSL realm of the world here. It's about provisioning SSL certificates up to your web server and automating that process as much as possible. For those of you who really love Linux and love typing in the two dozen commands that need to be done to be able to get that SSL certificate just in the right place and change your Apache or your Nginx configurations, Acme is doing a lot of that for you. Now, one of the big reasons why I think you should consider using Acme or look at automation for SSL certificates in general is exactly because this is what helps to avoid outages.
Right.
Get that out of your normal work stream, get it out of the manual processes that you do and just automate it. It just makes life easier. And Acme is one of those nice open protocols that does it well.
And it makes quality of life better as well. So one of the things that I have found as a theme when I talk to IT professionals, and I talk to a lot of them, is nobody really wants to dedicate their career to doing rote repetitive tasks. They want to dedicate their career to solving difficult problems and challenging themselves intellectually and adding real value. And so this is a perfect example. You can create that as an automation and move on to the things that only a human can do.
Yeah, your skill set as a Linux administrator is far more valuable to be doing something else.
Absolutely. Don't waste your talent on doing rote repetitive tasks. Use your talent in a better way. And not just the individuals in these jobs, but the value chain, the reporting chain all the way up to the CEO. They all want the same thing, right? They want those people being fully utilized and being fully actualized, and repetitive tasks are not that. All right, so here's another one, and you may have answered this already, but this is more specific, so I'm going to make sure we covered it. It says IoT networks can get really big. I think they mean a lot of devices, but they also might mean a lot of servers on the back end on that. It just says IoT networks can get really big. Should I be concerned about issuing the number of certs I need to issue?
I think scalability is probably number one on the list of the reason why you need a purpose-built PKI. And so therefore, the question of should I do this myself is a question that you need to ask yourself. Even if you're a really, really large organization, the number of devices that you might be issuing, which obviously requires high scalability of your CA. But then the other really huge topic here, Tim, is are those devices working within something else? Are they interacting? Do they need interoperability? There's so many question marks around how are you provisioning those certificates? Is the CA technology you're using providing you with technology to help you to do provisioning and do the other various things such as code signing, all the various PKI functions that work with IoT technology that was originally developed in the 1990s or 80s? It just never dreamt of all these things for IoT, and therefore this is really where I have to say the idea of a purpose-built PKI probably is more important for IoT than anywhere else.
Yeah, and by the way, you just touched on a ninth use case we didn't even think about, which is code signing. At a bare minimum, extended validation code signing has to be done by an outside CA.
Tim, if we do this enough, we'll probably come up with a 12th.
Exactly. So here's another question. And actually, probably I should take this one. It said, why did the CA forum? I think it meant the CA browser forum. Why did the CA browser forum remove SSL certificates from internal use? So yeah, the norm used to be, the standard practice would be, if you bought off-the-shelf web servers to use in your own internal systems, what you would do is you would just obtain third-party SSL certs from a public CA and put them on those. And the reason for that was because you could be very confident about compatibility, and you had a full life cycle in place. You could deploy and revoke and replace and all of those things that you might want to do with a certificate. It was all pre-built because the CAs were providing this for the, the vast public internet use cases. And so that was what IT managers did because it was the easiest, most expedient way. But the trouble was that it left a potential security flaw. And that's basically that internal servers can have any name you want. So people were using internal server names that were just what made sense for them. And if I gave my internal server a name that left the door open for a spoofing scenario, let's say I name my internal server Bank of America, right? Who is the CA to say that my internal server should not be named Bank of America? Maybe that's a customer, maybe there's some other reason. But the trouble is, in the process, it also means that a malicious party could potentially use that to create a spoofed service or a spoofed web server. And so the decision that took place a few years ago was that just wasn't going to be allowed for SSL certificates, and it has been disallowed by the rules. And as a result, every IT department that used to just say, I'll just get SSL, I'll get public SSL certs and throw them on my servers because it's the easiest path forward, that path is closed to them now, and they need to do something else.
That's interesting, Tim.
Yeah. Okay. Here's this is, I got one more from Mark Anthony. It says, I use MSCA today. You talked about augmenting it with private CA. If I need a different CA anyway, should I just replace MSCA? So that's a good point, right? So you sort of say, I'm going to run these two CAs in parallel. Jay, are there pros and cons of keeping both, or just trying to move everything over to your other CA scenario?
I think in the most simplistic sense, in a modern sense, it would be really great if you could just start from a new hosted cloud-based CA, something very modern, and you can move on. Some organizations would be able to do that, and some wouldn't. The cutover for being able to do that is a lot easier than it was in the past.
Right.
But for those of you who want to keep your Microsoft CA because it's working and it's a very trusty part of your enterprise, that's an option as well. But if you're starting from scratch, if you're an organization who's facing GDPR and you're looking at all these use cases and going, my goodness, I've got an enormous amount of data going across my multi clouds. If I were starting from scratch, I'd be looking at a cloud-based hosted CA.
Right. So a new company, maybe a born in the cloud enterprise, a technology unicorn or something like that, is possibly just putting it all under their own private CA, and maybe that's the wise decision. But if you're a legacy business, you're a major bank, and you've been around for decades and decades, then you can keep using your Microsoft CA for those scenarios, and it's just fine. And you can run the two CAs in parallel. Is that right, Jay?
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right, Mark Anthony, last chance to text me any other questions. I think maybe he handled the other one, so I'm counting down Mark Anthony, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Make sure you search for our podcast if you want to hear more about this kind of thing. Make sure you keep your eyes peeled for your free white paper that's going to go into a deeper dive on how to support your Microsoft CA with a private CA. Jay, as always, it's a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thanks, guys.